A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
For the 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany, the Olympic Games...
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. So tausend Shabbos at the Skitzal.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Hebron.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be Katnusot.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Yehuda Geberer with Jewish History Soundbites, and here we are with part 3 on the Jewish history of Toronto, and this part 3 has been generously sponsored by the Rubenstein family of Toronto, Canada, and Ra'anana, Israel, in honor of Bill and Judy Rubenstein, Zichronim Livracha, the patriarch and matriarch of the Rubenstein family, and pillars of the Toronto Jewish community. Also has been generously sponsored in honor of Rabbi and Rebbetzin Sofer of Kahal Avreichim, the Shif Shul. So we also found out that in Toronto they're still in the lockdown, and here in Israel we're completely out of it, please God. So just showing our solidarity, and that's also why this is the first time of it in anything in the Jewish history of Great American Jewish Cities series on Jewish History Soundbites that we're having a part 3, as we have to provide more content for our brethren in unfortunately still on lockdown. Hope you get out soon and everyone feels okay. Got lots of feedback from the first 2 parts, some of which I'll just incorporate into the text, into in other words, into what I'm going to say. I just wanted to start off with a couple of those letters, though. One of them is says, just an interesting story with Toronto and Hasidic Rebbes. Once, Reb Moshe Weber came to Toronto, and he said, Toronto is a great town and has everything in it. Well, what Toronto is really missing is a Hasidic Rebbe. I think there were or are a couple of Rebbes there. I mentioned a few during part 2. But here is another letter I got. Rabbi Akiva Stefanski made a huge impact on the city when he came in the 1950s to lead the Beis Yaakov High School, as the thousands of girls who went through that high school can testify. Many of these students barely had anything to do with Judaism and are now living full Torah lives. He was also instrumental in bringing the Kollel to Toronto, and in his later years ran a Kiruv camp for non-religious girls. Another letter. You mentioned when talking about Rabbi Felder that you didn't know that Canada had an air force. There is a story that in the Lieutenant Birnbaum book about Morley Auerbach, who was a gunner in the Canadian Air Force. Every time he would drop a bomb, he would throw down a Yiddish newspaper afterwards so the Germans would know that there is a Jewish kid up there bombing them. Okay, fantastic. It's all great stories. Another community within Toronto that I wanted to talk a little bit about the history and runs almost into contemporary is the Gladstone Jewish community, which was first run by Reb Nachum Rabinovich, who was a fascinating character, had a colorful and influential career both in the south of the United States, later on in England. He was a Rebbe and a mentor of Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks. And then later on, in his later years, he was in Ma'ale Adumim in Israel, and he only passed away recently. But for several years, in the 1960s, for about almost a decade, he was a rabbi in this Gladstone Jewish community. He was in the Clanton Park Synagogue, and he actually did his PhD in the University of Toronto in 1971. So he definitely made his imprint on the Toronto Jewish community, and the Gladstone community was taken over afterwards by Rabbi Yitzchak Kerzner, who was the longtime rabbi there, and it was a very convivial and homey atmosphere in the shul, and he was like a father to his congregants, many of whom were Holocaust survivors, a very influential leader as well in the Toronto rabbinate in the post-war era. Another institution which I wanted to get to was CHAT, which is also known as the Tannenbaum Private Jewish High School, one of the largest Jewish high schools, albeit non-Orthodox, not exactly the most religious high school, but they had their own place in history also, because Reb Shimon Shkup's son had a son named Avram Shkup, who was also not so religious, to say the least. He was a teacher there in the associated Talmud Torahs, which was affiliated with CHAT. So you had that part of the Jewish community as well. But moving along to other institutions, this time back in the Orthodox community. So one of the main and major transformative changes that happened in the history of the post-war Toronto Jewish community was the founding and the development of the Lakewood Kollel, which I started to mention, but I want to get a little bit more in depth into it now. Of course, the heads of the Kollel, Reb Shlomo Miller and Reb Yaakov Hirschman, and my friend Srili Besser was able to fill me in on some of the details, especially on the Reichman family's role in building the Kollel. So apparently, it started with the patriarch of the family, Reb Shmaya Reichman, and his sons, Paul Reichman, Moshe Reichman, Albert Reichman, were both all of them were heavily involved in the building and development of the Kollel for the future of the Toronto Jewish community, for it to grow as a place of Torah, a place where it would be attractive for the young of the community who are going to study in yeshivas out of town would want to come back and settle in the community, which was not happening in the 1960s. So they wanted that to give an impetus for the growth and to be attractive for young families to come to the community, and this would really have a positive impact. And it was a revolutionary idea at the time. An out-of-town kollel was the first one ever, and the local people in the community weren't, they might have been receptive to the idea, but they didn't found the idea strange, and it was as a concept that was literally completely unheard of, to bring the atmosphere of a yeshiva to a distant community and inspire the locals. So Moshe Reichman hosted a meeting of local businessmen to share the idea of the Kollel and to get the funding, and different ideas were shared for a location, and someone mentioned an empty storefront on Bathurst. And they said one of the people there said, if you take that space, then perhaps the Kollel will actually benefit the city, because the landlord there has been struggling to find a tenant for some time now. And that's how it was looked at that point. It was just a new idea that people had to take time to get used to. Someone else at the meeting said, if you say a Kollel is good for us, then I'll help you. But tell me one thing, what's a Kollel? But it gets off the ground, and like I mentioned, in the previous episode, part 1, I think, that Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky had earlier been a rabbi in Toronto. He kept his connection to the city. His second wife was from Toronto, and he would visit often. So he would visit often, and he had a great influence on the development of that Kollel, as did Reb Shneir Cutler, the Rosh Hashiva of Lakewood, who eventually the idea of the out-of-town Kollel became very closely connected and affiliated with the Lakewood Yeshiva and Reb Shneir Cutler, and the vision, of course, of Reb Nosson Wachtfeigel, the Mashgiach of Lakewood. But Toronto was the first place that it happened. They gave their support, and they sent their Talmidim of Lakewood, Reb Shlomo Miller and Reb Yaakov Hirschman, to become, the heads of the Kollel, and they assemble a group, and in 1970 the Kollel starts. It gets off the ground, and they bring another novelty to the city. They bring a stender, and they decided that it's going to be a real yeshiva look. They're going to bring a stender. So this was the first stender officially in Toronto history. I highly doubt that it was the first one. They're probably in the Stiebels of the 1920s. They also had stenders, but so it has gone into the lore of Toronto Jewish history that this was the first stender. So let it be that way. Either way, so the Reichmans they buy a place for the kollel. They help the funding for the housing for the first kollel members, and then the bridge is built between the kollel and the wider community, so that it shouldn't be an ivory tower. There should be a close connection between the two, and they should be a part of the community. And of course, one of the other things that Moshe Reichman tried to do at this point is to have the community. To have the community involved in the kollel, that it shouldn't be a Reichman kollel. Everyone should be involved. It should belong to the community, and the funding should come from the entire community. And that was a very strong preference and of how it should be built. But an interesting story is that Ramesh Reichman, who valued the kollel, and one day he came into the kollel directly from work, and he approached Rabbi Hirschman, the Reish Kollel, and he said, "My accountant told us today that the rate of inflation has shot up by 7%. So please adjust the kollel checks to make sure that the salary of the younger light who study in the kollel matches the cost of living." So that's the attention to detail. Through the 1970s, and it's also it came originally from the initiative who I mentioned, Rabbi Akiva Stefanski, who is the principal of the Beis Yaakov. The idea of the kollel actually came from him as well, together with the Reichmans. Interestingly enough, the fact that it was the first Lakewood kollel, so that means that Toronto, the Jewish community of Toronto, as well as the Reichman family, deserve credit for the entire community kollel project that ensued afterwards in the 1970s and 80s throughout the United States and beyond. So since the pioneering effort came from Toronto and then their initiative, so they definitely get the credit. Over the years, the kollel influenced either directly or indirectly almost every Torah institution in the city. The community was very receptive and welcoming, including the old rabbis who I mentioned in part one, Rav Ram Aaron Price, Rav Gedalia Felder. In fact, Rabbi Hirschman recalled visiting the local rabbis when they arrived in Toronto, and he said most of them were, tremendous Talmidei Chachamim. They didn't have an audience at the time in Toronto who appreciated their Torah knowledge. But Rav Shlomo Miller knew every piece that they had contributed to rabbinic journals of the day and was intimately familiar with their Sfarim and their Tshuvas. So all these elderly rabbis, they fell in love with this young Talmid Chacham who understood them. They felt understood, and that was one of the reasons that the kollel was received so well, was because of that immediate Torah connection that was made between the younger Shlomo Miller and the elderly rabbis. It was a very small, close-knit group in the early years, and Albert Reichman, who was heavily involved in the kollel, would join them for davening and was like part of the family. There's an interesting story from those early years, right after the kollel's arrival. Upon exiting the building, the young men of the kollel in their suits and black hats caught the attention of a group of youngsters who were idling at the corner of the street. The group was a colorful bunch. Many of them were sporting long hair down to their shoulders. Approaching the younger light, the boys inquired who they were and what they were doing on top of the Judaica store, which was the first home of the kollel during that time. And the members of the kollel responded that they were studying Torah. Torah, what's that? So they said, come up and we'll show you. In this legacy of outreach, which involved studying with local boys and reaching out to different members of the community, which eventually these boys went to yeshivas such as Telz and Shar Yashav in Farakwe and other yeshivas. This started the legacy of outreach to the community. So another. I mentioned Albert Reichman. So Albert Reichman, him and his family, once the Iron Curtain fall, he was heavily involved in rehabilitating Russian Jewry, with the whole Refusnik movement, and as the Iron Curtain fell, and reestablishing Jewish communities in Eastern Europe, in Moscow, and Kiev, and Minsk, Budapest, and much, much more. The help in the local schools, rabbi salaries in schools with the Canadian Foundation, spearheaded by Albert Reichman. He was involved in getting that initiative and project off the ground as well. I mentioned in one of the earlier episodes about Ner Yisrael in Toronto. So I just found out, submitted by one of the letters, one of the people I spoke to from Toronto, was the fact that the initiative to start a yeshiva high school in the 1950s came from the Toronto Jewish community, and they first turned to YU, to MTA, to open a high school, and YU and MTA refused. So they then went to Ner Yisrael, and Ner Yisrael said, yes, we'll open a branch there. So one of the big what-ifs of Toronto Jewish history is, what if YU would have said yes? So that would have been an interesting thing to speculate, how that would have impacted the development afterwards, and that's a cute thing to imagine about and hack about over the Chalon this coming Shabbos. Now, it was a large community of Holocaust survivors after the war, and that added to the family atmosphere among the emerging Jewish community, especially of the immigrants post-war, because the Holocaust survivors, large percentage of the Orthodox community after the war was survivors, and these people did not have families; they had lost their families, so it became a very close-knit unit. And again, I'm still on Ner Yisrael. By the way, another prominent member of the people who are lovers of Toronto Jewish history, Baruch Weiss, he was able to supply me with a lot of information and stories. I just wanted to thank him for that as well. And I mentioned how Reb Shalom Gold was the founding Rosh Yeshiva of Ner Yisrael in Toronto, but it was started by a local named Mr. Meir Leibovich. And he eventually asked Mr. Hofstadter and Mr. Bleeman to take over the yeshiva presidency. And then eventually, in the 1970s, when Naftali Friedler became the Rosh Yeshiva, then it broke off from being a branch of Ner Yisrael in Baltimore, and it became its own independent yeshiva. It was not the only yeshiva. Eventually, the Reichman family opened their own yeshiva, actually named after the patriarch of the family, Zichron Shmar Yoho, and Reb Chaim Mendel Brodsky was hired to be the Rosh Yeshiva there, bringing him from the Mir Yeshiva in Yerushalayim, where he was the son-in-law of Reb Nachum Partzovich. And that goes for yeshivas. Of course, there are other yeshivas as well. But to move on, I started talking about in last episode some of the philanthropic families. There are many more. There's the Kashitsky family, the Puslins family, the Sharp family, the Mandelbaum family, the Gassner family. And a letter from a listener writes as follows: truth is, Toronto is blessed with dozens of Jewish families who either past or present keep the community going. So if I don't mention some of them, then don't be insulted. I can't obviously get to all of them. One of the prominent members of the Jewish community at that time was Julius Kuhl. He was originally from Sanok in Poland, born to an Orthodox family. He moved to Switzerland after being orphaned as a child. He eventually got a PhD in a university there in Switzerland, and he eventually works for the Polish government in exile during the war, and he was a part of a team in the Polish diplomatic mission in Switzerland with several Polish non-Jews and with the cooperation of the consuls of several South American countries to produce fake citizenship papers for thousands of Polish and Dutch Jews to attempt to save them from the Nazis. Many were saved in this way. Since he's Jewish, so he's not eligible for recognition as a righteous among the nations by Yad Vashem, who only recognize non-Jews with that distinction. We have to talk about him here to make sure he gets the honor what's due to him, since he can't get official recognition because, unfortunately, he's Jewish. So in about 1950, he moved to Toronto, became very successful in business, and he remained there for about 30 years before retiring to Florida. During his years in Toronto, he was very active in the building of the Toronto post-war community and its institutions. Hofstadter family, and of course today you have Dirshu, which is synonymous with the Hofstadter family and with the development and building of Torah, not just in Toronto but worldwide. Of course, it's not just philanthropy, but Toronto has its fair share of Jewish music and culture. You have Abie Rottenberg and Shlomo Simcha. And I remember when I was a kid, there was like a little concert in the camp I was attending in the mountains, and Shlomo Simcha was there, and he said, Abie and I decided, why should we have to go to New York to record? We can record right here in Toronto, and that's how the Aish albums came out. So it came from Toronto, Jewish pride, and that goes along with the Pirchei albums and Dr. Harvey Ehrlich, and there's a lot there to talk about as well. When talking about Jewish culture and music, so I want to go back to the pre-war. No, I'm jumping around chronologically a bit, so it might get confusing. But let's perhaps go back to the pre-war, where I want to focus on another facet which I haven't really touched on in the first two episodes, and that is the flourishing of Jewish culture, of Yiddish culture, there in the immigrant communities in the first half of the 20th century in Toronto. The Yiddish theater flourished in, just like in New York City and the Lower East Side, so the Yiddish theater in Toronto flourished there for a time. Politics, again, in the 1920s and 30s, there's Jewish communists, there's the Zionists of all streams from the left to the right and the center. The Agudas Yisrael is developing in Toronto, the Mizrahi, the religious Zionists, youth groups, all flourished in the interwar period. There was a Yiddishist school named for Wael Peretz, and they even received a grant once from the rabbinical organization which oversaw Shechita, which I mentioned in part one, and the surplus from the Shechita, all those taxes and everything, went towards educational programs. So their endeavor to oversee the needs of the entire diverse Jewish community in Toronto at the time, they even gave grants, this religious rabbinical organization that oversaw Shechita, they even gave a grant to the Wael Peretz Yiddishist non-religious school. And speaking of Yiddishists, the Arbeiter Ring was quite active in Toronto at the time. Yiddishist socialists, communists, affiliate organizations, they were pretty well established when compared to other communities in North America. For example, the Yiddish newspapers, either socialist leaning or non-socialist leaning, lasted well into the 1960s and 70s, for, much longer than almost any of the other cities aside from New York in America. There were mutual aid societies, Landsmannschaften of groups who came from the original, based on their place of origin in Europe. In many ways, and I mentioned this already in part one, it was a miniature Lower East Side type of culture. Later on, there are Jewish mayors. Interesting story, though, with a Jewish sportsman. It was a fellow by the name of Sammy Luftspring, who was a professional boxer, and he was invited to be on Team Canada in the 1936 Olympics, which is to take place in Berlin, and he goes ahead and boycotts the Olympics, and he refuses to take part in it because it was being held in Nazi Germany with Hitler and all the racism involved and his anti-Jewishness, and this was his statement to not partake in those Olympics. Speaking of anti-Semitism, so in 1933, there was the Christie Pitts riot. An infamous riot took place on August 16, 1933, 6 months after Hitler came to power in Germany. News of which, what he was already doing to the Jews of Germany at that time, was being reported in the local press. It was during the Great Depression, and the Jews of Toronto at that time were primarily immigrants of the working class. Many of them were poor, and during the summer they would come to the beaches, and this was resented by many of the local non-Jewish Canadians who resented, there was animosity. It was immigrants, poor, foreigners, and a group of them formed the Swastika Club to be provocative against the local Jews. And this riot breaks out at a local baseball game. It was an open display of anti-Semitism, swastika, Nazi symbols, even cries of "Hail Hitler." There was a lot of beatings, violence. It was a full-blown riot for 6 hours. No one was killed, but many were injured, and the police were criticized for delayed intervention. Interestingly enough, the Italians, who were immigrants themselves, supported the Jews during the riot, which was also symptomatic of the time in New York also. And it was a xenophobic and anti-Semitic expression, which often goes together. Unfortunately, it's something we see until this very day. Continuing on Jewish culture, but moving on to the contemporary scene. So the singer, quite a famous singer, so I'm told, the singer Drake is Jewish, and he's from Toronto. And then in sports, in hockey, you have one of the Tannenbaums, a nephew of Joe Tannenbaum, is the owner of the Maple Leafs and the Raptors. And I remember when growing up that Sean Green, which his original family name was Greenberg, was the Jewish player on the Toronto Blue Jays. Of course, afterwards he played for much more Jewish teams. He played for the Mets and the Dodgers, and had quite an impressive career. Was probably the greatest Jewish hitter since Hank Greenberg, who is not related but had a similar name. So that's Jewish. Well, but if we go back to the general history of the post-war, like I said, a very, very high proportion of Holocaust survivors who become like family as they had no one else. And in the post-war, one of the most dominant features of Toronto Jewish life is that the Reichmans come onto the scene. In fact, my good friend Sruli Besser is working on a book on Moshe Reichman, and it's going to be a fantastic book. It's in its final stages, and I'm sure everyone's going to go and purchase it. If you like the Nishmas book, you'll for sure like this, because it's even better. It's an actual historical account. And so he was gracious enough to share with me just a couple of stories so I can share with you. And of course, it's going to be a sneak preview to the exciting things that are going to go on in that book. I mentioned in the previous episode Tatei Rav, Reb Meir Grunwald, who was a grandson of the Arugas Habaysim, Reb Moshe Grunwald, the son of Reb Avraham Yosef Grunwald. They were actually related to the Reichman Gestetner family. Reb Meir Grunwald, the Tatei Rav, he had been the rabbi in Teitch in Hungary, but during the war he lost his wife and children, and he was conscripted into the army and then captured by the Russians. And he was eventually released. He was in Siberia for a time, and eventually he headed to he tried to head to the United States. His uncle, the Tzelem Rav, who I mentioned recently on the Chust episode, and he tried to join him there in New York, but he ended up in Canada in 1949, in Toronto, with his second wife and children, and that's it. There was no one there was there to welcome him. No one was there to crown him rabbi. There wasn't much available for him to do. He decided he's opening his own shul on his own initiative, and he called it Shleimei Emunei Yisrael. And in the 1950s, when the Reichmans moved to Toronto, all of a sudden this shul came to life, and they joined it, and they created that Hungarian Oberland atmosphere, and in this way Reb Meir Grunwald was able to realize his dream because of the Reichmans. And then the Reichmans started supporting the Eitz Chaim, the local schools, and Mrs. Renee Reichman, she did not limit herself as a very famous Holocaust activist. She didn't limit herself to supporting the local institutions, but she went out and helped people on her own, for real help, not just with money. She once entered a local store, and the proprietor confided with her that his wife wasn't feeling well. So Mrs. Reichman asked a few questions, and after realizing that the situation was quite serious, she had her driver take her and the ailing woman directly to the hospital. In her accented English, she got back to work just as she had in Vienna of a different time, petitioning doctors and advocating for the patient. She has a husband and children who need her. You can't let her die, Mrs. Reichman kept insisting, not relenting until surgery was scheduled and a course of treatment decided upon. She had left Tangier and the Vaad Hatzalah was no longer, but she was still going with her chesed projects. At one point, Rav Moshe Reichman went to consult with the Satmar Rebbe, Rabbi Eilish, about where to raise his children. He said, maybe I should move to Montreal because they have a much stronger chinuch infrastructure at that time, 1950s, 1960s, and it was very much rooted in the Hungarian tradition. In Toronto, the Rebbe, so the Satmar Rebbe said, you can also raise your children in Toronto. You can raise them Erlich. And so he said. So what Moshe Reichman's solution was to create the Torah and Chinuch system in Toronto for his children. In 1965, when the Teitcher Rav passed away, quite relatively young, he was 58 years old. So one of the members of the shul was Reb Lipa Vechter, who had been planning on moving to Williamsburg to be close to his Rebbe, the Satmar Rebbe. Now the Reichmans wanted him to stay local and become the rabbi to replace the Teitcher Rav, since they needed a Haimish Rav. So the Satmar Rebbe said to Reb Lipa Vechter, stay in Toronto. You stay there and be the rabbi of that shul where the Reichmans are, and everything will be fine. And so together with the Reichmans, Reb Lipa Vechter, with regards to kashrus and shchita and this community, and after his passing, when Reb Lipa passed away, he had in his will that he be buried in Monroe, near the Satmar Rav. But he did not want to be flown there because he didn't want any airline personnel, non-Jewish airline personnel, to be handling his body. He only wanted religious Jews to be handling his body. So they thought they would have to drive there, but it would be a very long car trip. So instead, the Reichman family chartered a private plane and accompanied him to Monroe. Eventually, they founded another school, Yesodei HaTorah, and the survivor community primarily sent their children to that school. The school flourished, and that became another institution. Another yeshiva, by the way, in Toronto is Reb David Kaplan, the son of the famous Rabbi Baruch and Vichna Kaplan, Yeshivas Nachlas Tzvi. Another phenomenon that happens in the post-wars, in the 1960s, a large contingent of Sephardic Jews arrive in Toronto. And I had the privilege of speaking to one of the leaders of that community, Rabbi David Kadosh, and he was able to share with me the history of this, fascinating history of this community all the way down to the contemporary. The Sephardic community is made up mostly of Moroccan immigrants who arrived in Toronto, in Canada, in the 1950s and 60s, but it is different than the Montreal one, which I discussed in the Montreal episode. The Toronto Sephardic community comprises primarily from Tangier and Tetuan, which is the area of Spanish Morocco, while those in Montreal are from the French parts of Morocco, which is for obvious reasons. In Quebec, the French, fit in better. So Mr. Maurice Ben-Zatzar, one of the community founders at the time, was working for the Jewish Immigrant Aid Services, and he was instrumental in bringing in families and setting them up, especially that they didn't know the language and also had very insufficient funding to establish themselves. And he helped set up one of the first synagogues, Magen David Congregation, which is one of the few French Moroccan synagogues in the city, but most prestigious and authentic. At the same time, they built the Petach Tikva Anshe Castilla congregation, which, as its name implies, Castilla is Spanish Moroccan Jews, which is led by the community leader Leon Oziel. And then the Oziel family, after Leon tragically passed away at a very young age, they continued to be the backbone of the synagogue and continues following the traditions of Spanish Moroccan Jewry in Tangier. The Petach Tikva eventually hired a rabbi, Chacham Amram Asiag, who was a student of Rabbi Shalom Asas in Yerushalayim, and he was a native Moroccan Jew, and he initiated the Sephardic Rabbinate of Ontario, and was instrumental with Mr. Ben-Zatzar and philanthropist Mr. Jackie Benquisis to open the first and still only Sephardic Jewish day school called Or HaEmet. Mr. Benquisis had a dream and a vision to buy land and build a school on its own premises. So in the 1980s, he purchased a plot of land in the developing city of Thornhill, which is right near Toronto, and today one of the largest Jewish communities in the country. And eventually, they opened a Sephardic Kehillah Center in the 90s, which was a full-blown Jewish community with all the services of a Jewish community. Even had a host to smaller local Sephardic communities such as the Iraqi community in Toronto, the Bukharian, and it's one of the most majestic and magnificent synagogues in the world, and it's actually a replica of one of the grand synagogues in Toledo, Spain. Interestingly enough, the tourist attraction. In fact, the King of Morocco himself donated a stunning fountain that sits in the lobby of the synagogue, which is fascinating because I don't know if the Prime Minister of Hungary or the President of Poland or Vladimir Putin ever donated anything to an Ashkenazi synagogue in Brooklyn. So the fact that the King of Morocco has this affiliation with a Sephardic synagogue in Toronto, it is in itself historic, which reminds me that I am going on a trip, leading a trip to Morocco very soon, and you'll definitely want to join us for that. It's a public trip, an open trip with ENS Tours, and you should definitely sign up. It's going to be an amazing and exciting trip in about a month from now, if I'm not mistaken. But going back to Toronto, with the opening of the Kehila Center, so the community is growing, and in fact, they even had a kollel, a Sephardic kollel, run by Rabbi Yosef Oziel and Rabbi Eliyahu Zrian, opened up, and today the community is run as a measure of success and growth and health of a community. The Sephardic community is run by local native born rabbis who were born in Toronto. You don't have to import anyone when you can produce your own. In fact, Chacham Asi, who I mentioned, sat on the Toronto Bezdin with Rabbi Ox and Rabbi Shochet, who I mentioned previously in part 2, in regards to Gittin. Why? Because it was something he insisted on to ensure that there was a Sephardic representation so that the names can be spelled according to the Sephardic tradition. So there's an influx of Jewish immigration from Montreal in the 1970s and 80s when the government and the politics started changing in Quebec. So many Montrealians started moving to Toronto as well. In fact, Russian Jews started moving from the Soviet Union to Toronto as well. So there's this really diverse Jewish community from many countries around the world. In fact, the Russian Jewish neighborhood is nicknamed Little Moscow. So today it can be, it's quite a diverse community. So this was, I think, enough after 3 parts on the history of and leading all the way down to contemporary of the Jewish community of Toronto. So this is Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudigeber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, sponsorships, and lectures. You can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.